She boarded the plane expecting nothing more than a quiet flight overseas. Dr. Amara Kingsley, world-class neurosurgeon, calm, dignified, and exhausted after saving a child's life, was looking forward to a few hours of peace. But within minutes of stepping into first class, the atmosphere shifted. A single clash over a carry-on bag spiraled into something darker, something rooted in prejudice, not policy. A flight attendant's voice cut through the cabin. The accusation was sharp, the words dangerous, and before Amara could even process what was happening, airport police were on their way. Why did a respected doctor suddenly find herself treated like a threat? What happens when a false accusation takes flight and the truth struggles to catch up? And what would the crew do if they knew who her husband really was? The man about to walk through that cabin door. This is a story about power, bias, and the fight for dignity at 35,000 feet. A story that could change the way you see air travel forever. Before we begin, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines. A first-class ticket meant nothing when the person scanning it had already decided you didn't belong. Dr. Amara Kingsley knew that truth better than most. But that morning, as she stood at Gate A-17 of Redwood International Airport, she thought she might be able to outrun it. Just for 7 hours. Just long enough to cross the Atlantic in a leather seat, sip a glass of champagne, and let the hum of the engines swallow the exhaustion that had been living in her bones for days. The terminal was alive with its usual chorus, the roll of suitcase wheels on polished tile, the garbled voice of an overhead announcement, apologizing for a delayed flight to Dallas, the distant hiss of an espresso machine behind the glass walls of a coffee kiosk. Redwood was an airport that never slept, and neither did the people who passed through it. Amara had not slept much herself. 48 hours earlier, she had been standing under the blinding surgical lights of St. Raphael's Medical Center, her gloved hands deep in the delicate landscape of a 12-year-old boy's brain. A blood clot had been pressing against the motor cortex, threatening to take away his ability to walk, speak, maybe even breathe. The surgery lasted 13 hours. When she finally stepped away from the operating table, the boy's life was safe. Her own energy, however, had been left behind in that sterile, high-stakes room. Today's flight to London was not a vacation. It was another stop in the constant rotation of conferences, consultations, and emergency calls that filled her calendar. But she had carved a small promise into the itinerary she would rest on this plane. She would be anonymous for 7 hours. She would simply exist in Seat 2A, a quiet figure in a tailored navy sweater, soft gray scarf, and dark jeans. She had boarded early, thanks to the privilege of first class and the efficient smile of the gate agent who recognized her name. Ethan Brooks. His badge read, "Young," with clear hazel eyes and a voice that carried a hint of the Midwest. He scanned her ticket and offered a genuine, "Enjoy your flight, Dr. Kingsley." It was the kind of courtesy that warmed the edges of her fatigue. The jet bridge smelled faintly of metal and recirculated air. Amara stepped through it, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Inside were only the essentials: a change of clothes, a tablet loaded with medical journals, and a small black notebook she carried everywhere. That notebook held thoughts she couldn't always say aloud. Today, it might have held the words she needed to keep herself calm. First class on Global Star Airways was its own small world, tucked behind a heavy curtain that separated it from the steady shuffle of economy. Wide seats stretched into pods, angled toward large windows. Soft light spilled from overhead panels, warm against the brushed metal accents. It smelled faintly of citrus and something more expensive, like the inside of a new car. She found her seat, 2A, by the window, a sanctuary. She slid her satchel under the seat in front of her and reached up to store her carry-on in the overhead bin. The bag was a standard size, the same one she had taken on dozens of flights before. It had always fit. Today, she was a little slower than usual. Fatigue made her muscles less precise, and the angle felt wrong. She shifted the bag once, twice, then paused to adjust her grip. It was in that pause that she heard the voice. Having some trouble there, it was polite on the surface, but the undertone was sharp, as if she were interrupting a delicate routine. Amara turned her head. The lead flight attendant was standing just behind her. Sharon Keating. The name tag read, late 40s, pale blue eyes that flicked up and down in one practiced sweep, hair the color of wheat, styled into a perfect helmet that looked as unyielding as her posture. Amara offered a small, tired smile. Just a bit. It should fit. I've flown on this aircraft many times. Sharon stepped forward. Let me. She grasped the handle and gave it a theatrical shove. The bag didn't move. She tried again. Harder this time. The bin rattled faintly. She stepped back, frowning. This isn't going to work. You'll need to gate check it. Amara felt the first ripple of frustration, quiet and unwelcome. I'd rather not. My connection is tight, and this bag has fit before. If I turn it on its side, ma'am. Sharon's voice dropped an octave, losing its thin veneer of politeness. I've been doing this for 20 years. I know what fits and what doesn't. This doesn't fit. We can't delay the flight for an oversized bag. Oversized. The word landed like a false charge. Boarding had barely begun. The aisle was still clear. This wasn't about a delay. Amara kept her voice even. It's not oversized. I fly often, and I'm very familiar with baggage dimensions. May I try one more time? She reached for the handle, but Sharon moved into the space, her palm resting firmly on the bag. No, my decision is final. It needs to be checked. The conversation could have ended there. Amara could have nodded, surrendered the bag, taken her seat, and buried her thoughts in a book. But the chill in Sharon's gaze told her this was not about luggage. It was about something Sharon saw the moment Amara stepped on board, something she did not expect to see in seat 2A, for reasons she could not name. Amara thought of the boy in the hospital bed, his parents gripping her hands in gratitude. She thought of the years it had taken to stand where she stood. She thought of the times she had swallowed slights and slurs because the fight wasn't worth the cost. She drew a slow breath. Could you please call another attendant or the purser for a second opinion, perhaps a fresh set of eyes? I am the lead attendant, Sharon said, her voice rising. Passengers a few rows away began to glance up, and my decision is final. Are you going to comply, or are you going to be a problem? The word was a knife, carefully unsheathed. Amara's mind cataloged the moment, the tone, the audience, the script she had seen play out in news clips and shaky phone videos. She had hoped today would be different. That hope was slipping away. She stepped back. There's no problem, she said quietly. I'm asking for assistance. There's no need for hostility." Sharon let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're refusing to follow crew instructions. That's a federal offense. I could have you removed from this flight." Amara looked past her, to the jet bridge door. Ethan was still at the gate desk, watching, his brow furrowed. He knew something wasn't right. The bag sat between them, a silent witness. Amara's hands remained at her sides, steady. Inside, a slow, familiar calculation began to take shape, one that measured not just what she would do next, but what it might cost. Amara sat back in her seat, the armrest cool under her fingertips. The bag dispute still lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge. But for now, Sharon had walked away to greet another passenger. Amara let her eyes drift toward the oval window. Beyond it, the tarmac shimmered in the late morning sun, a dance of heat waves and moving shadows as ground crews loaded luggage into the belly of the aircraft. Her body ached in a way only long stretches in the operating room could produce. She could still feel the weight of the surgical mask on her face, the gentle throb in her lower back, the faint indentation the gloves had left on her wrists. For most people, those details faded after an hour or two. For her, they stayed as reminders not of pain, but of purpose. 2 days earlier, she had walked into an emergency room to find a family on the brink of despair. A 12-year-old boy, brain hemorrhage, prognosis uncertain. The surgery had been long and treacherous, her focus sharpened to a single thread that ran from her mind to her hands. One slip, and the boy's life could unravel. When she finally stepped back, the crisis was over. The boy lived. His parents cried, holding each other as if the world had returned to them. It was moments like that that kept her going, and yet the cost was steep. She often found herself racing from the operating room to an airport, from a hospital in one city to a conference in another, never quite catching her breath. She'd gotten used to living in motion, to existing in liminal spaces like airport lounges and hotel rooms, but she never stopped longing for a pocket of stillness. Today's flight to London had been planned for months. A keynote address at a global neurosurgery summit, meetings with colleagues from around the world, and a dinner with a former mentor. It was a trip filled with professional obligations, but she had promised herself something small and precious that she would rest on the journey there. 7 hours to recharge, to let her mind drift. Marcus had urged her to take it easy, to remember she was human before she was a surgeon. Marcus Kingsley. Even thinking his name brought a quiet steadiness to her chest. He was more than her husband. He was her anchor, CEO of Redwood International Airport, the man who orchestrated the movement of millions each year, yet still made time to leave her coffee in the kitchen before dawn when she had an early surgery. They had met a decade ago at a charity fundraiser. She, skeptical of his charm, he, intrigued by her focus. Over the years, they had learned to navigate their respective storms side by side. Marcus was across the airport now, in a meeting with visiting officials from an overseas airline. She had texted him earlier to say boarding was on schedule. He had promised to meet her for dinner in London after he arrived on a later flight. That had been the plan. Plans, she knew, had a way of shifting. A soft chime overhead pulled her attention back to the cabin. The boarding process continued. Business travelers in pressed suits stowed their laptops. A couple in matching windbreakers discussed the best museums to see in the city. Somewhere behind the curtain, the faint sound of a baby fussing rose and fell. Amara took a slow sip of water, feeling her shoulders loosen just enough to breathe deeply. But even as she tried to settle, she couldn't quite shake the moment with Sharon. It wasn't the inconvenience she'd dealt with stricter attendants, smaller bins, even misplaced luggage before. It was the edge in Sharon's voice, the way her eyes had narrowed with something more than impatience. Amara had learned to read that look. It was the look of someone who had already decided who you were and what place you deserved. She thought of the countless airports she'd passed through, the quiet calculations she made at each security checkpoint, the way her professional titles sometimes shielded her and sometimes made her a bigger target. Being a black woman in the spaces where she was the exception carried a weight that was hard to explain to those who didn't live it. It was a weight that could turn even the smallest interaction into a battle for dignity. She reminded herself of her own rules for survival in such moments. Stay calm, stay clear, choose your words like you're choosing instruments in the operating room precisely, deliberately, without wasted motion. She had no interest in turning this into a confrontation. She only wanted to be left alone to rest. Sharon passed by again, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle. Her smile to another passenger was warm, almost indulgent. Amara noticed the contrast, the ease with which Sharon's tone shifted when speaking to others. She forced herself to look away, unwilling to feed the small ember of irritation. Instead, she reached for her phone, scrolling through the conference schedule she'd saved. Names of speakers, session titles, a note to herself to prepare slides for the final panel. A voice from the row behind her caught her attention. Two men were discussing a recent sports game, their conversation casual, unhurried. It reminded her of Marcus's voice when he talked with his friends, low, even laced with quiet humor. She wondered what he would think if he had witnessed her exchange with Sharon. She suspected she knew. Marcus didn't respond well to people mistreating those he cared about, especially when the reasons were unspoken but unmistakable. She decided she wouldn't bother him. Not yet. He had important matters to handle, and she was capable of managing a small disruption. Or, at least, she told herself it was small. As the final passengers boarded, the cabin filled with the scent of coffee and the faint tang of jet fuel. Overhead, bins clicked shut. The hum of conversation dimmed. For a moment, Amara let herself imagine that the rest of the flight would pass without incident, that the earlier tension would dissolve into the background noise of travel. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the plane's gentle sway as luggage shifted in the compartments above. Somewhere deep down, a small voice whispered that this wasn't over, but she pushed it aside, choosing instead to focus on the promise she'd made herself: 7 hours of quiet, a glass of champagne, and nothing else. Outside, the ground crew signaled to each other, preparing for pushback. Inside, the curtain to first class swayed slightly as someone moved through. The air felt still for a heartbeat, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. The last of the passengers trickled into first class. Amara kept her gaze on the window, watching a baggage truck trundle past below. The engine's steady hum blended with the muffled conversations around her, creating a cocoon of sound that almost lulled her into believing the earlier moment with Sharon had been nothing more than a brief misunderstanding. Almost. She was adjusting the scarf around her neck when a shadow crossed her peripheral vision. Sharon was back. This time, her smile was faint and tight, the kind of expression that said the face was for show while the eyes told the truth. "I'll take that for you," Sharon said, reaching for the handle of Amara's carry-on without waiting for a reply. Amara turned slightly in her seat. "It's fine. I have it under control." Sharon's fingers tightened on the handle anyway. "We're making room for other passengers' bags. This will need to be checked." The calm in Amara's voice was deliberate. "It's a standard carry-on. It fits. I've traveled on this aircraft before." Sharon's pale blue eyes flicked over her face, then down to her travel clothes as if reassessing what she saw. "We can't delay boarding over this," she said, her tone dropping into a clipped rhythm. "Rules are rules." The words landed with a familiar weight. Amara had heard them in different forms over the years at hotel desks, at conference check-ins, even in hospital corridors when someone questioned her credentials. Rules were never really about the written policy in those moments. They were about who someone decided those rules applied to. "May I try adjusting it myself?" Amara asked. She kept her voice even, but there was an edge beneath the surface now. "If I turn it on its side, it will fit." Sharon didn't move. Her hand stayed firmly on the bag, blocking the way. "No, my decision is final." Passengers nearby began to glance up from their seats. The air in the cabin shifted subtly, curiosity and unease threading together. Amara noticed the change, and so did Sharon. The attendant straightened her posture, tilting her chin slightly higher, as though solidifying her role as the authority in the space. Amara's patience thinned. She wasn't here to cause a scene, but she wasn't going to let herself be brushed aside without reason. She drew in a slow breath. "Could you call the purser or another crew member for a second opinion?" Perhaps they could. "I am the lead attendant." Sharon interrupted, her voice a notch louder. "There is no second opinion." Her gaze swept briefly over the onlookers, as if collecting silent validation from their presence. "Now, are you going to comply, or are you going to be a problem?" The word hung in the air. Problem. It was more than a label. It was a warning. It was the signal that, in Sharon's eyes, Amara's presence had shifted from passenger to potential threat. Amara could feel the familiar crossroads forming in her mind. One path led to quiet compliance, hand over the bag. Let it be checked, endure the rest of the flight in silence. The other led to holding her ground, knowing it could escalate into something far more damaging. Either way, she understood the stakes. In spaces like this, perception often became reality faster than facts could catch up. Her voice dropped to a measured calm. "There's no problem here. I'm simply asking for assistance." Sharon's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Hostility isn't going to help you, ma'am." The insinuation tightened Amara's chest, though her expression didn't change. "I haven't been hostile. I'm speaking plainly." Sharon's gaze narrowed. "You're refusing to follow instructions. That's a federal offense." A ripple went through the nearby seats. A couple across the aisle exchanged glances. The man in 3C shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the two women. Ethan, still visible through the open jet bridge door, leaned slightly forward at the gate desk, his brow furrowed, his hands fidgeting with a stack of boarding passes. Amara noticed all of it. She had learned to register details even in moments of pressure, the tone of a voice, the set of someone's jaw, the silent reactions of a crowd. It was second nature to her as a surgeon, and it served her just as well here. The pattern unfolding in front of her was one she knew too well. She thought of Marcus, of how quickly his expression would harden if he were watching this play out. She thought of the boy she had operated on, how his parents had trusted her completely with their child's life. That trust, that respect, was nowhere in Sharon's eyes. "I'd prefer to keep my bag with me," Amara said, her tone unchanged. "I have personal items I need during the flight. You'll get them in London," Sharon replied sharply. It wasn't about the bag. Amara knew that now with absolute certainty. This was about presence, about belonging, about who was allowed to settle into a seat like 2A without being reminded they were being tolerated, not welcomed. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest as she considered her next move. Compliance might make the moment disappear, but it wouldn't change the truth of what had just happened. Resistance might expose the unfairness. But at what cost? Sharon's voice broke the silence. "Last chance, ma'am." Amara met her gaze. "I've done nothing wrong." Sharon blinked once, slowly, then leaned back slightly. "Very well," she said, almost under her breath, before stepping away. For a moment, Amara thought it might end there, but the tension in Sharon's shoulders as she walked down the aisle told her otherwise. She had seen that kind of retreat before, not surrender, but the quiet gathering of reinforcements. Sure enough, Sharon disappeared behind the curtain into the galley. Amara could hear muffled words, a clipped tone. She couldn't make out the exact phrases, but the rhythm was unmistakable. Someone building a case, someone setting a scene. Ethan appeared briefly in the jet bridge, glancing toward the galley, then back to Amara's row. His expression carried both concern and hesitation, as if weighing whether to intervene. Amara took another slow breath. She was no stranger to pressure, but this was a different kind of theater. The stakes here weren't life and death in the surgical sense. They were about dignity, reputation, and the fine line between passenger and suspect, and she could feel the script moving toward its next act. She didn't know yet that the call Sharon was making would bring 2 police officers onto the plane before it ever left the ground. She didn't know yet that within the hour, Marcus would walk down that same jet bridge and change the course of the day for everyone on board. For now, she only knew that the cabin had grown a little quieter, the air a little heavier, and the eyes of more than a few passengers were fixed on her. The murmur of boarding had nearly faded when Sharon returned. She emerged from the galley with the same rigid smile, but her eyes were colder now, more calculated. The way she held herself made it clear she wasn't coming back to help. She was coming back to make a point. "We've decided your bag needs to be gate-checked," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Please hand it over." Amara turned in her seat to face her fully. "My bag fits. I've used it on this aircraft model many times. I can place it in the bin if you'll allow me to adjust it." Sharon shook her head slowly, as if dealing with someone stubborn and unreasonable. "You've already been given instructions. Continuing to argue is delaying the departure of this flight." The accusation was absurd. Amara glanced toward the aisle. Several passengers were still standing, settling into their seats. A flight attendant on the far side of the cabin was helping a man lift a guitar case into an overhead bin. No one was waiting on her. "I'm not delaying anything," Amara replied evenly. "I'm ready to sit down as soon as I stow my bag." "You've been uncooperative since boarding," Sharon said, her tone sharpening, "and now you're raising your voice." Amara's voice had not risen, but that didn't matter. The words were being laid like bricks, building the narrative Sharon wanted. She could see the scaffolding of it forming the official-sounding phrases that would justify whatever came next. A man in 3C leaned toward the aisle, his eyes flicking between them with interest. Across from him, the woman in 3D shifted uncomfortably, looking down at her phone. Most people in the cabin seemed to know the unwritten rules: stay out of it. Don't get involved. Amara's fingers tightened on the armrest. She could end this now by giving up the bag, but every instinct told her that doing so would be conceding more than just overhead space. This was a test of place and presence. If she gave in here, she was silently agreeing that she didn't belong. "I'm speaking calmly," she said, her tone steady, "and I'm asking for a reasonable solution. Let me try again, or allow another attendant to assist." Sharon's pale eyes locked on hers. "I don't need another opinion. You're refusing crew member instructions. That's a serious violation." A ripple moved through the nearby rows. Amara could feel the weight of the onlookers' stares pressing against her shoulders. She had seen this dynamic play out in airports, restaurants, and public spaces, the authority figure framing the other person as a problem, and the crowd beginning to accept that framing simply because it was easier than questioning it. From the jet bridge. Ethan's voice carried faintly as he finished scanning the last tickets. He looked toward the cabin, his expression caught between concern and indecision. Amara recognized that look. He knew this wasn't right, but he also knew the risk of contradicting a senior crew member in front of passengers. Sharon stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it personal. "I can have you removed before we even push back." "Do you understand?" Amara held her gaze. "I understand that I've done nothing wrong." Sharon's lips thinned into something between a smile and a sneer. Without another word, she turned and walked briskly toward the galley again. Amara watched her go, aware that this was no retreat. It was preparation. The minutes stretched. Passengers were now buckled in, flipping through magazines or adjusting seat belts. The low rumble of the air system filled the silence. Somewhere behind her, a child laughed. The ordinary sounds of boarding should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like the calm before a storm. Amara felt the shift before she saw it. The curtain parted, and Sharon stepped back into the aisle, her voice projecting clearly this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a passenger in this cabin who's refusing to comply with crew member instructions. For everyone's safety, we're going to pause departure until this is resolved." Heads turned, conversations stalled. Every eye in first class seemed to find her. Amara could feel the heat of the attention. It was an old, unwelcome sensation being made the center of a scene you didn't start, being cast in a role you didn't choose. She kept her shoulders square, her chin level. "I'm not refusing instructions," she said, speaking to Sharon but loud enough for others to hear. "I've asked to stow my bag in the bin where it belongs." Sharon folded her arms. "You've been hostile since you boarded. When I attempted to assist you, you were aggressive and confrontational." Gasps and murmurs moved through the cabin. Aggressive, hostile. The words were deliberate choices. The kind that landed heavily when directed at a black woman in a public space. They were loaded enough to justify action, vague enough to be impossible to disprove without witnesses willing to speak. Amara's mind moved quickly. She had been in enough charged situations to know that evidence was her ally. She slipped her phone from the seat pocket, tapped the camera icon, and began recording. The movement was small, discreet, but Sharon noticed. "Are you recording me?" Sharon demanded, her voice rising. "For my protection," Amara said simply. "That's it," Sharon said, turning toward the front of the plane. "You are a security threat. I'm calling the authorities." The words struck like a gavel. Passengers shifted in their seats. A man in the second row muttered under his breath. Sharon disappeared again, her footsteps brisk on the carpet. Amara's pulse quickened. She forced her breathing into an even rhythm. She thought of Marcus, of the calm he carried even in conflict. She imagined his voice in her ear. "Stay steady, stay sharp." A few moments later, the jet bridge door opened. Two uniformed officers stepped in, one older, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw set in a firm line, the other younger, leaner, his eyes scanning the cabin with a flicker of curiosity. Officer Hardy and Officer Vega. They spoke briefly with Sharon at the front. She gestured toward Amara's seat. Her voice, pitched just high enough to carry, "She refused instructions, became aggressive, and shoved me." The last phrase sent a jolt through Amara. Shoved. A physical act she hadn't committed. A fabrication now spoken as if it were fact. It was the kind of lie that, once heard, was hard to unhear. Hardy's eyes locked on her. He began walking down the aisle. Vega just behind. The cabin was silent now except for the soft thud of their footsteps. Amara set her phone on her lap, the camera still rolling. Her heart beat a steady, deliberate rhythm. She had been here before in different forms, standing at the edge of someone else's story they were trying to write over her own. This time, she would keep her place on the page. Hardy stopped 2 steps from her row, his stance wide, one hand resting near the radio on his shoulder. Vega hovered slightly behind him, watching her with a careful, measured gaze. The older officer didn't bother to introduce himself before speaking. "Ma'am, we've received a report that you assaulted a member of the flight crew. Is that correct?" The phrasing made it clear it wasn't really a question. Amara lifted her eyes to meet his. "No, that report is false. There was a disagreement about my carry-on, and the attendant escalated it into a confrontation. I never touched her." From the front of the cabin, Sharon scoffed audibly. "She shoved me. Right here." She rubbed her forearm with exaggerated care, as though presenting evidence to a jury. "And when I told her I was calling for help, she started filming me, trying to intimidate me." Hardy's eyes flicked from Sharon to Amara. If he noticed that the supposed injury didn't match the distance between them, he didn't show it. "I'm going to need to see your identification and your boarding pass." "Of course," Amara said. She reached down for her satchel, moving slowly, deliberately. Every motion was calculated. In situations like this, sudden movements were too easily misread. As she opened the flap, Hardy added, "And put the phone away. You're not to record police officers." "With all respect, officer," Amara said, pausing mid-motion, given the nature of the false accusation, "my legal counsel would advise me to continue recording for my own protection." Hardy's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, we are conducting an investigation. Put the phone down or I'll consider it obstruction." From just behind him, Vega shifted his weight. His eyes moved from Hardy's rigid posture to Amara's steady gaze. Something in his expression suggested unease, as if he could sense there was more here than what Sharon had claimed. "I am not obstructing," Amara clarified, her voice calm but unyielding. "I am documenting. There's a difference. I have been wrongfully accused of a crime, and I am being threatened with removal from a flight I paid for. I am within my rights." Hardy's lips thinned, but he didn't argue further. He reached for the ID she offered, Vega took it instead. Glancing at the name, his eyebrows rose slightly. "Dr. Amara Kingsley," he said aloud. Hardy barely reacted. "Listen, doctor or not, here's how this is going to go. You can either leave the flight voluntarily, and we sort this out with the airline, or we detain you for assaulting a flight crew member. Your choice. But this plane isn't going anywhere with you on it." The injustice pressed on her chest like a weight. She thought of the boy in the hospital bed, of the long hours spent saving his future. 2 days ago, her hands had been trusted with a life. Now, she was being treated like a criminal over a suitcase. No, not over a suitcase. Over the fact that in Sharon's eyes, she didn't fit the image of a first-class passenger. "I will not be leaving voluntarily," she said, her voice steady. "If you detain me, you will be doing so without just cause, and I assure you this will not end well for anyone who perpetuates this lie." Hardy let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, your husband's on his way. Is that it? He gonna come sort us all out?" The sarcasm was deliberate, dismissive. Sharon, standing behind him, smiled thinly, almost triumphant. She could feel the tide of authority on her side. Hardy's presence was her reinforcement, her guarantee. Passengers remained silent, but the tension in the cabin was thick. A man in 2C leaned back in his seat to get a better view. Someone in the back of first class was quietly recording on their phone. Amara caught the movement in her peripheral vision and felt a flicker of gratitude. If nothing else, the truth might find its way out. Hardy took a step closer. Last chance. "Ma'am, walk away, or we take you away." The air shifted. It wasn't a sound at first, but a sensation, a sudden change in the room's energy. Conversations in the terminal beyond the jet bridge died away. Passengers who'd been watching leaned back instinctively. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder in the silence. Then came the sound of footsteps, firm, deliberate, each one carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. The crowd in the terminal parted almost naturally, leaving a clear path to the jet bridge entrance. Vega turned his head first, curiosity in his eyes. Hardy glanced over his shoulder with mild annoyance that quickly drained into something paler. Sharon kept her gaze on Amara, too focused on her own sense of victory to notice. Marcus Kingsley stepped into view flanked by 2 senior airport officials in tailored suits. He wore charcoal gray, the jacket cut perfectly to his tall frame, his tie an understated navy silk. He wasn't a man who raised his voice to command attention. He didn't need to. The space seemed to realign itself around him. He walked past the gate desk without slowing, his gaze locking on Amara. She felt the tension in her body release just a fraction as he came to her side. "Amara," he said softly, his voice meant for her alone. "Are you all right?" "What happened?" She kept her answer simple. "I'm fine now. The lead attendant fabricated a story that I assaulted her and called the police. Only then did Marcus turn his attention to the others." The temperature in his voice dropped to something glacial. "Officer Hardy," he said evenly, "you're standing on property managed by my authority. My wife texts me that she's being harassed, and I find you threatening her with detention without having established a single fact. Explain to me which part of your protocol involves believing an unverified accusation without even listening to the other party." Hardy opened his mouth, but no words came. His shoulders stiffened. The realization of who Marcus was had settled in. Sharon blinked, finally registering the change in atmosphere. She looked between Hardy, Vega, and the man in the suit. Her smirk faltered as the pieces clicked into place. Marcus's eyes moved to her. He didn't raise his voice. "Ms. Keating, you accused my wife of assault. That's a serious charge. Do you have any evidence, witnesses, or is your word all that's required to ruin someone's reputation here?" Sharon's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The confidence she'd carried minutes earlier wavered under his gaze. It was the kind of look that cut past pretense, straight to the truth someone didn't want to face. Marcus turned slightly, catching sight of Ethan at the gate desk. "Mr. Brooks, would you join us?" The young gate agent approached, his hands clasped together, nerves visible in the tightness of his jaw. Marcus's tone softened just enough to encourage him. "I want you to tell me exactly what you saw. No fear, no spin." Ethan drew a deep breath. "Dr. Kingsley was trying to put her bag in the bin. It was a little stuck. Ms. Keaton came over and told her it had to be checked. Dr. Kingsley stayed calm, asked to try again or get another attendant. Ms. Keaton refused, got louder, and accused her of delaying the flight. When Dr. Kingsley took out her phone, Ms. Keaton started yelling that she'd been assaulted, but she wasn't. Dr. Kingsley never touched her. She never even got close." A low murmur moved through the cabin. Sharon looked as if she'd been slapped, her eyes darting to the passengers who'd heard. Marcus nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks. That will be noted." Then he looked back to Amara. "Were you recording?" She held up her phone. From the moment she accused me of hostility, Marcus's gaze swept over Hardy, Vega, and Sharon. "Then we have a witness and video evidence. This conversation is over." For the first time since she'd boarded, Amara felt the balance of power shift. The storm that had been gathering now had somewhere else to break, and it would not be over her. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Amara sat in her seat with her phone resting lightly in her palm, the camera still recording. Her face was calm, but her mind was anything but. The entire situation. From the first moment Sharon had blocked her at the bin, had been sliding toward this point. It was like watching a glass tip in slow motion, knowing it would shatter, yet powerless to stop it once momentum took hold. Marcus remained beside her, his presence a shield. But she knew how thin that shield could become if the wrong decisions were made in the wrong order. She had seen it happen to people she knew. A quiet incident twisted into a spectacle. A claim repeated enough times to sound like truth. An accusation sticking harder than the evidence to disprove it. She had been in high-pressure moments before. The operating room demanded calm in chaos. But those moments were driven by the will to save life, not by someone else's determination to diminish it. What gnawed at her now was the understanding that no matter how rational she stayed, the story being written about her could still outrun the facts. Her eyes drifted to Hardy. The older officer had shifted his stance, but his face still carried that mix of authority and assumption. She recognized it instantly, the look of a man who had already decided how this would end and was only going through the motions to make it official. His presence here was not about balance, it was about control. In contrast, Vega's posture was different. He was alert, observant, almost uneasy. His gaze moved between her and Sharon, between Marcus and Ethan, as if tracking threads in a story that didn't quite line up. She caught that flicker of thought in his eyes, a hesitation she silently hoped would grow into something more. She thought about how quickly things could shift if Marcus hadn't come. Would she already be off the plane? Would her name be moving through some quiet airport security channel, marked as a disruptive passenger? Would anyone here, other than Ethan, have spoken the truth? Her fingers tightened slightly on the phone. This recording was her only undeniable anchor to reality. Without it, the only narrative would be Sharon's. She could imagine the exact words being typed into an incident report, each one cutting away at her credibility. Aggressive, refused instructions, escalated situation. Words that could follow her into airline records and stain her name in ways she couldn't undo. Marcus leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I'm here now. We're going to resolve this." She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak without letting her frustration bleed into her tone. She knew he meant it. She had seen Marcus navigate corporate crises that would have left other executives scrambling. But this was personal. The man who controlled the contracts, leases, and operations of this airport was standing in defense of his wife, and that meant the ground beneath Hardy and Sharon was already shifting. Still, a part of her felt the old weariness. Why did it always take this much? Why did dignity need to be defended like a fortress under siege, when for others it was granted without question? She thought of the years she had built her career, the hours, the sacrifices, the relentless pursuit of excellence, and how quickly all of it could be overshadowed by a single baseless claim. Hardy stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Kingsley, with all due respect, we received a call about a physical altercation, and you didn't investigate before treating my wife like a suspect," Marcus said evenly. "You didn't ask for witness statements, you didn't review security footage, you didn't even ask her to explain before demanding she leave the plane." Hardy's mouth opened as if to respond, but Marcus's gaze held him silent. The weight in that look was more than positional authority. It was the force of someone who knew exactly how far his influence reached. Vega spoke for the first time. "Sir, I haven't seen anything that indicates Dr. Kingsley was aggressive. She's been calm since we arrived. The admission was small, but it cut through the tension like a clean incision." Hardy glanced at his partner, something unspoken passing between them. Vega didn't look away. Sharon's voice broke the moment. "She shoved me. Are you calling me a liar?" Officer Vega's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm saying I haven't seen any evidence to support your claim." A subtle murmur moved through the cabin. The tide, which had been pulled firmly in Sharon's direction minutes ago, was beginning to shift. Amara could feel it, though she stayed perfectly still. Marcus straightened. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take Ms. Keating's statement, you're going to take Ethan Brooks' statement, and you're going to secure a copy of my wife's recording. You're also going to document that my wife was seated and calm when you approached, and that she complied fully with your requests." Hardy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being directed in his own jurisdiction. But he also knew that this was not a typical passenger and not a typical situation. The man standing in front of him had the power to make sure every misstep here would be reviewed at the highest levels. Amara's pulse steadied slightly. She wasn't out of danger, not yet, but the balance was shifting. She looked at Marcus and saw the controlled fury in his eyes, the same calm ferocity she'd seen when he was on the phone negotiating with a stubborn airline executive or cutting through a bureaucratic blockade. His power wasn't in shouting. It was in stripping away the room someone thought they had to maneuver. Inside, she wrestled with conflicting emotions. Relief that he was here, frustration that she had needed him here, a deep, simmering anger that Sharon could weaponize a lie so casually. Knowing the reflex of authority would likely land on her side, she thought again of the boy she had operated on. How fragile life could be. How easily the wrong movement could end everything. This felt different, but the fragility was the same. One false step, one wrong word, and the damage could be permanent. Her grip on the phone tightened. She would not hand that over without ensuring she had a copy. She would not allow her voice to be erased from the record. "Marcus," she said quietly, "make sure Ethan's statement is documented before anything else happens." He gave the faintest nod. "It will be in the galley." Another attendant peeked through the curtain, curiosity in her eyes. Sharon noticed and turned away slightly, as if to shield her expression. But it was too late. The look on her face, tight, defensive, and just a shade uncertain, was visible long enough to register with more than a few passengers. Amara drew in a slow breath. Whatever happened next, she knew this, she had not bent. She had not been reduced to silence, and that, in itself, was a kind of victory. Marcus shifted his stance. "Officer Hardy, Officer Vega, let's step off the plane for a moment. We're going to resolve this properly." The officers exchanged a glance. Vega gave a single nod. Hardy exhaled slowly, as though calculating the cost of digging in any deeper. Amara watched them go, her phone still in her hand, the recording still running. For the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself to believe that the truth might win out here. But she also knew the battle wasn't over until the entire script Sharon had tried to write was torn apart in full view of everyone who had been made to watch. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was a quiet command, the kind that drew attention without demanding it. As he moved deeper into the cabin, passengers straightened in their seats. Some tilted their phones discreetly, recording. Others just stared, recognizing that something had shifted in the air. He placed a hand lightly on Amara's shoulder before looking toward the front of the plane. "Ms. Keating," he said, his tone even but carrying the weight of authority, "would you step forward?" "Please." Sharon froze halfway down the aisle, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The passengers' eyes were on her now, and she didn't like it. "Sir, I'm in the middle of—" "You are in the middle of a false accusation," Marcus interrupted, still calm, still precise, "and we're going to address it immediately." Her eyes darted to Hardy, searching for support. The officer shifted uncomfortably. Vega kept his gaze on Marcus, clearly aware of who he was dealing with. A few rows back, Ethan Brooks stood near the bulkhead, almost visibly relieved. Marcus turned to Hardy. "You've taken the accuser's statement. Now you'll take the witness's statement. And you'll review the recording my wife has been running since the moment this began." Hardy's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew when a line of authority was beyond his reach. "Fine," he said, the word reluctant. "Let's hear it." "Ethan," Marcus said, nodding to the gate agent, "you can speak freely here." Ethan stepped forward, glancing briefly at Amara before focusing on Hardy and Vega. Dr. Kingsley boarded early. She tried to put her bag in the bin. It was snug, but it would have fit. Ms. Keaton came over, told her to check it, and when Dr. Kingsley asked to try again or get help, Ms. Keaton refused. She wasn't aggressive. She didn't raise her voice. Then, when Dr. Kingsley took out her phone. Ms. Keating started yelling that she'd been assaulted. She wasn't. I was right at the gate and saw the whole thing. Sharon's face flushed. That's not how Marcus's gaze cut to her, and the rest of her sentence died in her throat. You've been given an opportunity to back up your claim with facts. Ms. Keating, he said, you've offered none. The younger officer spoke then, his voice quiet but clear. Sir, from what I've observed since boarding, Dr. Kingsley has been calm. I've seen nothing to indicate a threat. Hardy glanced at Vega, clearly unhappy, but the damage was done. The balance had shifted in plain view. Passengers weren't whispering anymore. They were watching openly, waiting to see what Marcus would do next. He turned to Hardy. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to document that a false accusation was made. You're going to include the witness's statement and my wife's recording. And you're going to note the absence of any physical evidence or credible testimony supporting Ms. Keating's claim. Hardy swallowed, the stubborn line of his jaw softening. Understood. Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. Ms. Keating's security credentials for this airport are revoked as of now. Officer Vega, you'll escort her off the aircraft once she collects her belongings. She'll be turned over to her airline management, not paraded through here like a spectacle. I want her gone before this plane leaves the gate. The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Sharon's lips parted as if to protest, but the sight of Hardy avoiding her eyes told her the fight was over. She turned stiffly toward the galley, her back rigid. Marcus shifted to stand in the aisle beside Amara. His presence seemed to fill the space, pushing back the tension that had been pressing in since boarding. Dr. Kingsley will remain in her seat, he said to Hardy. She will not be removed. She will continue her journey without further harassment. Passengers began to murmur again, the low hum of conversation tinged with something different now. Approval, satisfaction. The story was changing before their eyes. Ethan lingered near the gate, a faint look of awe on his face. Marcus caught his eye and gave a small nod acknowledgement. And thanks. Ethan straightened his shoulders, as though reassured that speaking the truth had been the right choice. Hardy stepped back, his voice quieter now. We'll get statements and be on our way. Vega gave Amara a brief nod, the kind that said he'd seen enough to know which side the truth was on. Then he followed Hardy toward the galley, their radios crackling faintly. Marcus sat down beside Amara for a moment, leaning in just close enough for her to hear. It's Handel, he said softly. Her breath eased, but only slightly. For now. He studied her face, the calm mask she'd kept in place for the past half hour. You held your ground, he said. You did exactly what you should have. I shouldn't have had to. She replied. He nodded once, an acknowledgement rather than an argument. You're right, and it won't be ignored. From the corner of her eye, she saw Sharon being led out by Vega, her steps clipped and her face pale. The sight didn't bring her satisfaction, only a muted sense of inevitability. This was never about winning against one person. It was about what that person's actions represented. As the curtain closed behind them, Marcus stood, looking down the aisle toward the cockpit. I'll speak with the captain before I leave, he told Amara. Then I'll meet you when you land. She shook her head. I don't want to be here anymore. He paused. Then we'll both leave. Her eyes softened at that. She knew what it meant for him to walk off this flight, to rearrange whatever meetings and obligations he had ahead. But Marcus didn't hesitate when the choice was between his position and her peace. "I'll have your checked luggage pulled," he said, glancing toward one of his senior staff members near the door, "and I'll arrange a car to meet us at the executive entrance." Amara looked around the cabin one last time. Passengers were still watching, some with open curiosity, others with quiet respect. She caught Ethan's gaze and offered him a faint smile. He returned it with a nod. As she gathered her satchel, Marcus took her carry-on and, with a single easy motion, slid it into the overhead bin. It fit without the slightest resistance. The latch clicked shut with a sound that felt almost symbolic. "There," he said quietly. Her lips curved, but there was no humor in it. It was never about the bag. "No," he agreed. "It never is." They stepped into the aisle together. The murmurs followed them as they made their way toward the jet bridge. Marcus walking a half step ahead, his hand resting lightly against her back. The heat of the confrontation was already fading, but the shape of it remained in her chest, a reminder of how quickly dignity could be challenged, and how much it mattered to defend it. She knew this wasn't over, not in the way that counted. There would be reports to file, calls to make, and, if Marcus had his way, changes to enforce. But, for the moment, the simple fact that she was walking out with her head high was its own victory. Outside, the terminal noise rushed back in the announcements, the rolling bags, the chatter of travelers. Life at Redwood International went on as if nothing had happened. But for those who had watched it unfold, the image of the woman in 2A and the man who came for her would not fade quickly. Marcus didn't waste time once they stepped back into the terminal. The two senior airport officials who had accompanied him were already speaking in low, urgent tones into their earpieces. Passengers who had deplaned early lingered at nearby gates, clearly curious about the unfolding drama. Amara walked beside her husband, her pace steady, her expression unreadable. They stopped near a private conference room just past the security checkpoint. Marcus gestured for Amara to step inside. Hardy, Vega, Sharon, and Ethan followed, the latter looking like he'd been pulled into something far bigger than his usual duties. A member of airport security closed the door behind them. Marcus took a seat at the head of the long table. "Let's begin," he said, folding his hands. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "This is a formal review of the incident that occurred on board Flight 732 during boarding. All statements will be recorded and added to the incident file. You will tell the truth, or you will answer for the consequences." Hardy shifted in his chair but said nothing. Sharon kept her eyes fixed on a point on the wall. Vega sat upright, hands folded neatly, ready to speak if asked. "Ethan," Marcus began, "you will go first. You will repeat exactly what you told Officer Hardy at the gate, in as much detail as possible." Ethan cleared his throat. "Dr. Kingsley was trying to put her bag in the overhead bin. It was snug but could fit. Ms. Keating came over, told her it had to be checked. Dr. Kingsley asked to try again or have another attendant help. Ms. Keating refused. Dr. Kingsley stayed calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't touch Ms. Keating. Then, when Dr. Kingsley took out her phone, Ms. Keating started yelling that she'd been assaulted. That's everything I saw." Marcus nodded slowly. "And you are willing to sign a written statement to that effect?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Marcus turned to Vega. Officer Vega, did you witness any aggressive behavior from my wife at any point after you boarded the plane? Vega shook his head. No, sir. She was calm. She complied with instructions. I didn't see any evidence of a threat. Thank you. Marcus then shifted his gaze to Hardy. Officer Hardy, what led you to approach my wife as if she were already guilty? Hardy's jaw tightened. We received a call from the flight crew that a passenger had assaulted a staff member. When we boarded, Miss Keating confirmed she was the victim. Standard protocol is to treat crew safety as a priority. Protocol, Marcus repeated, his tone neutral but heavy with meaning. And what about the protocol to verify facts before removing a passenger? Did you ask for witnesses? Did you request to see my wife's recording? Hardy hesitated. No, Marcus said softly, almost to himself. That's the problem, officer. You assumed, you acted on an accusation without evidence, and you placed the burden on my wife to prove her innocence. That's not protocol, that's bias. A muscle in Hardy's cheek twitched. I'd treat every call the same way. Marcus cut him off. No, you don't, and you know it. The silence that followed was thick. Hardy didn't respond. Finally, Marcus turned his attention to Sharon. Ms. Keating, you have accused my wife of physical assault. That is a criminal charge. Do you have any evidence, any at all, to support that claim? Sharon straightened slightly, her voice defensive. She was aggressive. She got in my space. I felt threatened. Did she touch you? Marcus's question landed like a hammer. Sharon's lips parted, then closed. Not exactly. Not exactly means no, Marcus said, his voice sharp for the first time. You accused a passenger of a physical crime without contact, without injury, without a single witness to support you. Why her cheeks flushed? She was being difficult. She wouldn't just check the bag and sit down. Being difficult, Marcus repeated, is not a crime. And you escalated that to police involvement, knowing the weight such an accusation carries. You understand what that could have done to her life, her career, her reputation? Sharon's voice faltered. I didn't think that, Marcus said, is exactly the problem. You didn't think. You reacted based on your perception of who she was, not what she did. Amara had remained silent until now, but she spoke, her voice steady. Do you have any idea how often this happens to people who look like me? How many times we're assumed to be in the wrong before we've said a word? I have worked too hard, for too many years, to have my dignity stripped because someone decided I didn't belong where I was sitting. Sharon looked down at the table. Marcus leaned back slightly. Here's what's going to happen. Ms. Keating, you will be suspended from duty pending a full investigation. Your access to Redwood International property is revoked as of this moment. Officer Hardy, I will be filing a formal complaint with your department and the Airport Police Oversight Board. Officer Vega, thank you for your professionalism. Vega gave a small nod, though his eyes flicked toward Hardy with something like regret. Marcus continued. Ethan, your statement will go into the official record. You acted with integrity today, and that will be noted in your file. Ethan's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. Sharon's voice rose, brittle. You can't just. Marcus's gaze cut to her, and she fell silent. You've done enough damage. Ms. Keating, my wife and I will not be boarding that flight. The airline will be receiving a call within the hour from my office. This is not over. The meeting dissolved after that. Hardy and Vega left first. Hardy avoiding eye contact. Sharon was escorted out by airport security, her steps quick and stiff. Ethan lingered long enough to thank Amara quietly before returning to his post. When the room was empty, except for the two of them, Marcus turned to his wife. "You all right?" Amara nodded slowly. "Yes. I hate that this is what it takes for the truth to matter." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then we make sure it doesn't get buried. We'll handle it." Her lips curved faintly. "You always say that, and I always mean it." They walked out together into the bright terminal, the noise of travel rushing back around them, somewhere beyond the gates. Flight 732 would take off without them. That was fine. There were more important battles to win than the one against the clock. For Amara, the victory wasn't in the removal of Sharon or the reprimand of Hardy. It was in knowing she hadn't been silenced. She had stood her ground, and this time people had seen it. This time, the lie had unraveled in real time. By the time Marcus and Amara reached the private executive exit, the incident was already spilling beyond the walls of Redwood International Airport. Amara hadn't posted anything, and Marcus certainly hadn't. But several passengers had been recording from the moment the confrontation started, and those videos were finding their way onto social media faster than anyone could contain them. A young woman in a green hoodie stood off to the side of the curb, phone pressed to her ear while she uploaded clips to her feed. She wasn't subtle. "Yeah, that's the airport CEO," she said into her mic, glancing at Marcus with wide eyes. "And that's his wife. The flight attendant totally made it up. No, it's all on camera." Amara kept walking, the strap of her satchel resting in her palm, but she could feel the heat of dozens of eyes on them. They were no longer just travelers, they were a story, and stories travel faster than any plane. Inside the black sedan, waiting for them, Marcus closed the door and immediately pulled out his phone. "Mitchell," he said when his chief of operations answered, "get communications ready. We're going to control the narrative before the airline tries to spin it." He listened for a moment, then nodded. "No, not just a press release. We'll need the full sequence passenger footage, audio from Amara's recording, timestamps. Get legal to review it before we move." Amara rested her head briefly against the seat, feeling the tension in her shoulders refuse to loosen. "Do we really have to make this public?" "Yes," Marcus said without hesitation, "because if we don't, they will, and theirs won't be the truth." She turned her head to study him. "I know. I just hate being part of a headline." "You're not the headline," he replied. "The system that made this possible is..." The sedan pulled away from the curb, gliding into the late afternoon traffic. Outside, the city looked almost calm, the skyline glowing in soft gold, but inside, Marcus was already orchestrating the next moves. By the time they reached their home, the first edited clips were going viral. Hashtags had formed around the incident, some supportive, some predictably hostile. The sympathetic ones were growing faster, fueled by the clarity of Ethan's testimony and the visible composure Amara had maintained through the confrontation. Marcus's communications director, Leela Cheng, was already waiting in their living room. She had 2 laptops open, a phone in one hand, and a controlled urgency in her voice. "We've verified 8 separate passenger videos," she reported. 3 of them have audio clear enough to catch Ms. Keating's exact words. Ethan Brooks is already trending his statement about the false accusation is getting shared alongside the footage. Marcus took the chair opposite her, and the airline they've issued a generic statement about reviewing an onboard incident. No admission, no specifics. Lila glanced at Amara. They're stalling, hoping it blows over. Amara sank into the couch. It never blows over for the person accused. Not when the accusation fits a stereotype people already believe. Lila's eyes softened. Exactly. That's why we push back hard now. If we wait, they'll paint you as disruptive. And by the time the truth comes out, it'll be buried on page 10. Marcus nodded. We lead with facts, passenger footage, Ethan's statement, the audio from Amara's phone. No commentary, just the sequence as it happened. And when people ask for context, Lila asked. Then, Marcus said, we talk about the bigger picture, not just Amara. Every passenger who's been humiliated, detained, or removed because someone in authority acted on bias instead of evidence. Amara looked between them. That's going to make this bigger than we can control. That's the point. Marcus said, we're not just fighting for you, we're setting a precedent. They need to know there's a cost. Within hours, a carefully edited compilation was online. It began with Amara quietly placing her bag in the bin, Sharon stepping in to stop her, and the initial verbal exchange. The footage moved to Sharon's loud accusation, then cut to Ethan's clear, unwavering statement, followed by Officer Vega confirming there was no aggressive behavior. The sequence ended with Marcus ordering Sharon's removal. The impact was immediate. Comments poured in, many from people recounting their own experiences of being targeted in airports and on flights. Others praised Amara's composure, contrasting it with Sharon's rising hostility. But the backlash was there too predictable, familiar. A few accounts insisted the video didn't show what happened before. Others accused Marcus of throwing his weight around because of his position. Marcus didn't flinch when Lila showed him the numbers. We're not here to win everyone, he said. We're here to make sure the truth can't be erased. That night, Amara lay awake long after Marcus had fallen asleep. She thought about the passengers on that flight, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones who had filmed, the ones who had spoken. She thought about Sharon's face when she realized the lie wouldn't hold, and she thought about how easily it all could have gone the other way. She imagined a version of the day where Marcus hadn't been there, where Ethan had stayed quiet, where Vega hadn't spoken up. She could see herself being led off the plane, her protests unheard, her name quietly flagged in airline records. That possibility chilled her more than the confrontation itself. In the morning, Marcus's phone was already buzzing before sunrise. National outlets had picked up the story. Passenger interviews were airing. One network had even found footage of Sharon on a previous flight, in a tense exchange with another passenger. The airline's PR team issued a second statement this time, naming Amara and acknowledging that preliminary findings indicate the passenger did not engage in physical aggression. It was a carefully worded admission, but an admission nonetheless. They're trying to get ahead of the investigation, Lila said when she called, but it's too late. Public opinion has already swung. Amara poured herself a cup of coffee, the scent filling the kitchen. And what about the people who still believe the lie there will always be some? Lila said, but you've got more people seeing the truth in real time than most get in a lifetime. Amara took a slow sip, letting the warmth anchor her. She wasn't sure if she felt victorious or just exhausted. But she knew this, she wouldn't step back now, not when the light was on the cracks in the system. Marcus joined her at the table, his laptop open to a spreadsheet of names. These, he said, are the other incidents we've pulled from passenger complaints over the past 3 years. Similar patterns, same airline, same outcomes. Amara scanned the list, and you're going after all of them. He nodded. If they thought they could make this about one misunderstanding, they're wrong. We're making it about the system that allows it. She set her cup down. Then let's make sure they can't look away. The morning after the second wave of news coverage, Marcus sat in his corner office at Redwood International, a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass framing the runways. Planes came and went in steady rhythm, but the phone on his desk hadn't stopped ringing. He had already declined 2 interviews with national networks. This wasn't about scoring airtime, it was about leverage. And leverage worked best behind closed doors. Lila stood across from him, tablet in hand. The airline's CEO just called. She wants a private meeting before the board convenes this afternoon. Marcus leaned back in his chair. She knows she's in a corner. She knows more than that. Lila replied, "Our internal contacts say the crew union is demanding she defend Sharon publicly, or they'll claim this was an attack on all flight attendants. They're playing solidarity politics." Marcus's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered. Solidarity is earned, not weaponized. And this was weaponized. Amara entered the office quietly, dressed in a simple navy blouse and black slacks. She carried herself with the same calm dignity she had maintained on the plane. But Marcus could read the tension in the way she held her shoulders. "I'm coming to the meeting," she said before either of them could speak. Marcus studied her for a moment. "You're sure?" "Yes. They need to see the person they tried to reduce to an accusation." Lila nodded. "It could work in our favor, but we need to control the narrative in that room. They'll try to frame it as a misunderstanding." Amara's gaze sharpened. "Then we make sure the word misunderstanding never survives the first 5 minutes." By noon, they were walking into a sleek high-rise downtown, the airline's headquarters. The conference room was as polished as its public image long glass table. Leather chairs, a panoramic view of the skyline. At the head sat Marianne Doyle, CEO of Apex Airlines, flanked by her general counsel and head of corporate communications. She rose to greet them, her handshake firm but her eyes guarded. "Marcus, Dr. Kingsley, thank you for coming." Marcus didn't return the pleasantry. "We're here because your employee weaponized a false accusation against my wife in front of passengers, crew, and law enforcement, and because your management's first response was to protect itself, not the truth." Marianne's counsel shifted uncomfortably. "We're in the middle of an investigation," Amara's voice cut in, calm but unyielding. "I was there. I lived it. I don't need an investigation to know what happened." Marianne folded her hands. "Dr. Kingsley, I want to personally apologize for your experience. What Ms. Keating did." "What she did," Amara interrupted, "was accuse a black woman of assault because she didn't like where I put my bag, and she counted on the fact that people would believe her without question. That is not a service issue. That is a bias issue, and until you admit that, you're not addressing the problem." Silence filled the room for a beat. Marianne's communications chief cleared her throat. "We're prepared to offer a formal apology and a confidential settlement." "No," Marcus said. "This isn't about a check. It's about accountability." Marianne leaned back. "Then what exactly are you asking for?" Marcus slid a folder across the table. Inside was a concise list, 3 pages, typed, bullet-pointed. 1. Immediate termination of Sharon Keating. 2. Mandatory bias and de-escalation training for all Apex Airlines flight crew and gate staff, developed with input from independent experts. 3A. Public acknowledgement that the incident with Dr. Kingsley was the result of a false accusation and that she was treated unfairly. 4A. Formal review process for passenger complaints involving allegations of aggression, ensuring witness statements and video evidence are considered before removal or arrest. Marianne skimmed the list. You're asking us to overhaul our crew training program and change established security protocols. I'm telling you, Marcus replied, that if you don't, this story doesn't go away. Not this week, not next month. I'll make sure of it. Her counsel bristled. That sounds like a threat. It's a promise, Marcus said evenly. Amara leaned forward, her voice soft but cutting. Do you know what it's like to sit there, surrounded by strangers, with someone insisting you're dangerous knowing that your word means less than theirs because of how you look? That's what your airline allowed to happen. If you think you can fix that with a settlement and a press release, you haven't been paying attention. Marianne's gaze moved between them. She wasn't a fool. She knew the optics, the power dynamics, the fact that Marcus could weaponize his position as an airport CEO in ways that would cripple their operations. Finally, she exhaled. We'll take the list under consideration. I can't make commitments until the board reviews it. Then I suggest you move quickly, Marcus said, standing, because the longer you wait, the more leverage you lose. They left without shaking hands. Back at Redwood, Marcus convened his senior staff. This isn't just about Apex. This is about every airline that operates here. We're going to draft a protocol that ensures what happened to Amara never happens to another passenger, regardless of carrier. Lila nodded. We can integrate it into the airport's compliance requirements. Any airline that doesn't sign on risks losing gate priority. Amara listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She felt the weight of what they were setting in motion. This was no longer just a personal defense. It was a systemic offensive. That evening, the first cracks appeared in Apex's corporate wall. An anonymous flight attendant posted on an industry forum, claiming Sharon had a history of similar confrontations. Other crew members chimed in, sharing stories of passengers, particularly passengers of color, being targeted for minor infractions and then removed from flights. By midnight, those threads were being shared alongside the original videos of Amara's incident. The pattern was becoming visible to anyone who cared to look. Marcus sat beside Amara in their living room, the glow of his laptop reflecting off his glasses. They're losing control of the narrative, he said. Amara didn't smile. Good. Now let's make sure they can't take it back. 2 days later, Marcus received a call at 6 a.m. from a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was low, urgent. I'm a senior flight purser with Apex. You don't know me, but I know Sharon Keating. I've worked with her for over a decade. You need to hear what I have to say before today's board meeting. Marcus sat up in bed, one hand already reaching for a notepad. Go ahead. She's done this before. Not just once, several times. Usually to passengers she thinks won't fight back. People who don't have the connections or resources to challenge her. But those cases never went anywhere because the airline always backed her word over the passengers. The caller paused, as if gauging the risk of continuing. There are incident reports. They're buried, marked as resolved. If you can get those in front of the board, you can show them this wasn't an isolated event. "Will you testify?" Marcus asked. A long exhale. "If it comes to that, yes, but I can't go public yet." "My job, I understand," Marcus said. "Send what you can anonymously. Use a secure drop. I'll have my team handle it." An hour later, Lila had the files. 5 separate passenger complaints over the last 6 years, each echoing the same pattern, a minor disagreement with Sharon escalating into an accusation of aggressive or threatening behavior. 4 involved passengers of color. None had resulted in discipline for Sharon. At 9, Marcus and Amara walked into the Apex Airlines boardroom. The atmosphere was brittle, like a storm about to break. Marianne Doyle sat at the head, her face composed but her eyes giving away the pressure she was under. Around the table, board members shuffled papers, whispered to one another, or tapped nervously at phones. The general counsel opened the meeting with a recap of the incident. He spoke as if it were a single, isolated event, framed in careful legal language. Marcus let him finish before he placed a slim folder in the center of the table. "These," he said, "are 5 separate documented cases of Sharon Keating making nearly identical accusations against other passengers. 4 of those passengers were people of color. In each case, the passenger was removed, detained, or humiliated in front of others. In each case, there was no physical evidence, and in each case, Apex took Sharon's word over the passengers." The room went silent. One board member, a man with silver hair and a pinched expression, reached for the folder and flipped through it. "Where did you get these from someone who's tired of watching your airline protect a liability?" Marcus said evenly. Marianne's jaw tightened. "These reports are internal property. Possession of them outside authorized channels don't," Marcus said, his voice cutting across hers. "Don't try to make this about the reports instead of the reality they describe. You've known, or should have known, that Sharon was a pattern, not a mistake, and you let it continue." One of the older women on the board leaned forward. "Marianne, is this true?" Marianne didn't answer right away. Her silence was enough. Amara spoke then, her voice steady but carrying weight. "I don't care what happens to me in the press, but every person in those reports deserved better than what they got, and every one of you has the power to make sure it never happens again." Another board member, younger and clearly uneasy, said, "If we take disciplinary action now, the union will fight us. They'll claim we're setting a precedent for firing attendants based on passenger complaints. They should be fired," Amara said. "If their pattern is harming passengers, if they're weaponizing accusations, they shouldn't be in the air. That's not service. That's abuse of authority." The argument that followed was messy and loud. Some board members argued for appeasing the union, others for protecting the brand image at all costs. Marcus didn't raise his voice once, but every time the conversation drifted toward minimizing the incident, he brought it back to the documented pattern. Finally, one of the finance officers, who had been quiet until now, spoke. "If this gets out, if it hasn't already, we're looking at reputational damage, stock hits, and possible federal oversight. The CEO of Redwood International is already involved. The optics are catastrophic." The silence after that was thick. Marianne finally said, "We will terminate Sharon Keating effective immediately, pending a formal announcement. We will also review crew training protocols." Marcus didn't move. "Not review, implement. You have my proposal. You have 2 weeks to accept it in full, or Redwood International will impose it as a condition of your continued gate access." Several board members exchanged sharp looks. Marianne exhaled through her nose, clearly weighing the cost of fighting him. Fine. 2 weeks. The meeting adjourned with no handshakes. As Marcus and Amara walked out, she let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You think they'll follow through?" "They don't have a choice," Marcus said. "Not with what's already out there." By that evening, the whistleblower's leak had hit industry news. Anonymous crew members confirmed that Sharon had a history of targeting passengers for personal reasons. The union's public defense of her began to crumble as reporters pressed for answers about the pattern. Amara watched the coverage from their living room, a blanket draped over her legs. "It feels strange," she said. "Winning like this. I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, it's just heavy." Marcus sat beside her. "That's because it's not over. This isn't just about one person. It's about a system, and systems take longer to dismantle." She nodded slowly, leaning against him. "Then I guess we keep going." 2 weeks later, the boardroom battle was a memory, but the waves from that confrontation had only grown larger. Apex Airlines issued a press release that began with a line no one had expected to see. "We acknowledge that Dr. Amara Kingsley was wrongfully accused and wrongfully treated while traveling aboard Apex Flight 227. The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples across the entire industry. Sharon Keating's termination was confirmed that same morning. No sugarcoating, no mutual separation language. The statement cited a pattern of conduct inconsistent with Apex Airlines' values and passenger care obligations. It was as close to an admission of systemic failure as corporate PR ever got. Amara read the release over breakfast. She set the paper down and looked at Marcus across the table. "You got what you wanted?" "No," Marcus said, sipping his coffee. "We got what we needed. What I wanted would be never having to do this at all." The real change came in the days that followed. Redwood International announced its new Passenger Integrity Protocol, a policy requiring every airline operating at the airport to adopt bias training designed by an independent civil rights team, implement an evidence-first review for passenger removals, and establish a direct hotline for witnesses to report misconduct without retaliation. Other airports took notice. Within a month, 3 major hubs announced they were adopting the same requirements. Airline executives grumbled in private, but in public they lined up to endorse the forward-thinking passenger protections. For Amara, the victory felt complicated. She was glad to see structural changes, but she couldn't forget the faces of the people in those 5 buried reports. She thought of each of them strangers she would likely never meet, and wondered how different their lives might have been if someone had stood up for them in the moment. She also thought about the silence on that plane. Dozens of passengers, some recording, some just watching, and so few willing to speak until Marcus arrived. The truth was uncomfortable justice in her case had come not because the system worked, but because she was married to a man who could force the system to pay attention. One evening, about a month after the reforms rolled out, Amara was walking through Redwood International with Marcus. A woman approached them near the security checkpoint, holding the hand of a young boy. "Dr. Kingsley," the woman asked softly, I wanted to say thank you. I saw what happened to you on the news. Something like that happened to my brother last year. He didn't have anyone to fight for him. It ruined his job, his travel record, everything. What you did, it matters." The boy peeked out from behind his mother's leg. "You're the lady from the video," he said shyly. Amara crouched down to his level. "I'm someone who had help when I needed it. And now I'm trying to make sure other people get help, too." When they walked away, Marcus glanced at her. "That's the real reason you kept going, isn't it?" She smiled faintly. "It's one of them. The media eventually moved on to other stories, but the industry didn't forget. Every time a passenger was removed from a flight at Redwood, the incident was reviewed within hours. Patterns were flagged, witness statements gathered, and footage preserved. The quiet assumption that a crew member's word outweighed all other evidence began to crumble. A year later, Amara was invited to speak at the National Transportation Safety Board's annual conference. Her talk wasn't fiery. She didn't call for heads to roll. Instead, she spoke about dignity, the need for accountability that protects both passengers and crew, and the danger of letting bias, conscious or not, become policy by default. She ended with a line that lingered in the auditorium. "The sky belongs to all of us. So should the truth." Afterward, she stepped down from the stage to polite applause. Marcus was waiting in the wings, hands in his pockets, pride in his eyes. "You just rewrote the culture for an entire industry," he said. She shook her head. "No, we just reminded them that it needs rewriting." That night, sitting on their porch, Amara let herself finally feel the weight lift. The fear from that day on the plane was still there, buried deep, but it no longer owned her. She had taken it apart, piece by piece, and turned it into something stronger. In the end, the fight hadn't been about proving she wasn't what Sharon claimed she was. It had been about proving that no one should have to carry that burden alone. And as the planes passed high overhead, blinking against the night sky, she knew the work wasn't finished, but it had begun. What began as a quiet journey became a battle that shook an entire airline and changed its rules forever. Dr. Amara Kingsley's calm strength exposed not just one act of discrimination, but a pattern buried for years. It proved that silence protects the wrong people, and that standing your ground can rewrite the rules for everyone. The reforms born from this flight didn't just protect her. They now protect every passenger who steps onto a plane at Redwood International and beyond. But the truth remains without power. Her story could have ended like so many others in humiliation, not justice. That's why we tell these stories, to remember that dignity is not negotiable, that bias, whether whispered or shouted, must be confronted, and that every seat in the sky belongs to all of us. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to keep these conversations alive, because the next time injustice takes flight, you'll want to be here when we bring it back down to earth.